There are a lot of really cool features that we can implement on the Firepower appliances. And the overarching tool that we're going to use to coordinate those efforts and those features is something called the Access Control Policy. And in this nugget, we're going to take a look at the overview of a policy and how the pieces fit in to that access control policy. And let's use this topology and this FTD appliance right here for our discussion regarding an access control policy to kind of be the coordinator of all the features or functions that we want to inject or impose on our network traffic. And speaking of network traffic, let's go ahead and just logically talk together about a user like Bob here at this computer who's trying to access a resource on the internet, or actually anywhere through the firewall would be perfect. So as that traffic comes into the firewall, let's call this ingress traffic. The firewall is going to make some intelligent decisions right off the bat. If that ingress traffic, that traffic coming into the firewall, is part of an existing connection, the firewall is going to take some shortcuts based on already having tested that traffic and so forth, as it speeds that packet and that traffic along its way. So for this discussion, let's imagine that the ingress traffic is brand new. It's a new session that Bob just created or is attempting to create. Now, one of the first things that the firewall is going to do is going to check something called a pre-filter. Now, a pre-filter is a great thing to do early on. For example, if you and I decided, hey, let's get a career in XYZ, some brand new career, and then we realized, oh, there's no way that could ever happen. Let's cut our losses right now and not wait till the end of 3 or 4 years of training or schooling to realize that we can't do that. And that's what the pre-filter does on the firewall itself. The pre-filter takes an early stab at seeing what traffic could be dropped. Case in point, if we know that we don't want to allow tunneled traffic through the firewall, the pre-filter can look at that and say, oh, look at the protocols, look at the ports. I'm going to go ahead and drop this traffic. I don't even want to process it. I'm going to save my time right here. Now, assuming the traffic passes the pre-filter, the next thing the firewall does, it takes a look at layer 3 and layer 4 ACLs. Now, I'm doing an abbreviated version of this entire path because there's a few dozen more steps in between, but this is the big picture. And as part of our policy, if there's layer 3 and layer 4 access control lists that say drop the traffic, well, if they match, it's going to go ahead and drop the traffic. And access control lists on the firewall are processed like they are on most other networking devices. They're processed from top down, going through the list of rules. When there's a match, then there's an action taken. And one of those actions could be dropping the traffic. Another action would be allow. And if it's allowed, then that traffic would continue on its way. But the goal of these two elements right here is to drop traffic early if we know we don't want to deal with it or forward it for sure. We can drop it early in the process. So assuming that traffic is allowed, one of the next steps is security intelligence. I'll put SI for short, based on IP address and reputation. So from the cloud, if we have IP addresses that have been identified as malicious or bad, those can be blacklisted. So that could cause traffic to be dropped right there. So we don't have to continue, So the firewall does not have to continue processing it any further. If the IP address involved has been blacklisted, we can just drop it right here. And if the IP address has not been blacklisted and we're still forwarding traffic, says the firewall in its brain, then if we have an SSL policy that says we need to decrypt the traffic so we can analyze it and inspect it, the SSL policy would do that. And that's presuming it's an SSL session. And if we had an SSL policy and it was decrypted and the traffic is then forwarded on to the next piece, which is security intelligence again. And the benefit doing security intelligence again now after the SSL decryption is that we now have a better view of what's really being carried in that traffic. And now we can use security intelligence, and we can get security intelligence based on the URL that the actual customer is really going to, as well as DNS related information. So if there's any hanky-panky or malicious DNS or URL information, the firewall can then make the decision to drop it right there based on the rules. And assuming the traffic is still being forwarded by the firewall, the next thing we could do is our application or layer 7 filtering based on what type of user applications are being allowed through. For example, Bob could be using dozens of Google apps, Google Mail or other apps. And based on our policy, we can see what those are, and then we can choose to permit them or allow them or deny them. So traffic could be dropped there as well. And if traffic continues, and I'll go ahead and wrap this up going back the other direction now. If the app filtering allowed the application that Bob's trying to use, we could then go ahead and do file and malware analysis, looking for malicious files or files that have malware in them to drop them and stop them from proceeding through the network. As well as we could feed the traffic to the intrusion prevention system aspect of this next generation firewall and next generation IPS, this Firepower appliance. So those are both options. And so what we would do is we'd have file and malware policies and or IPS policies. And then in our access control policy, we would point to those IPS and file and malware policies as additional inspections that we want to perform on the traffic. And if everything passes, if the traffic doesn't get dropped at any one of these points, it can then be forwarded out the egress interface of the firewall onto its destination. So let's take a look at the interface on the Firepower Management Center and discuss it for a moment. And to see our access control policies, we'd click on Policies and then select Access Control from the drop-down or the sub-tab. And we're currently looking at the details of our starter policy, which we created when we deployed our first FTD appliance. Now, currently we have no rules, but we'd want to add rules to this policy, and they are processed in a top-down fashion. So the first rule is looked at, then the second rule, then the third rule, and then when that rule is matched, the action associated with that rule is taken. Here we have a link that would take us to the pre-filter policy. Now, one question that might come up is that if we have rules and none of them are matched, let's say we have 20 or 30 rules and a packet comes in on an initial connection and all the rules are checked and there's no match, what happens? Well, it takes the default action that we've specified. And currently we said network discovery only, and we set up network discovery only because we want traffic to flow through the firewall. So there are other options that we can choose for the default action, and that's what's being used if none of the other rules match the traffic as they're going through the firewall. So we're going to leave network discovery only as the default action until we get more granular and more controlling with the access control policy. There's also an option for each of our rules as well as the default action to do logging. And in a previous nugget, we actually turned on logging for the default action, but we have that same feature, that same option of doing logging on individual rules as we create them in our access control policy. And as we create our rules, if we do want to have further inspections done for file and malware analysis and or IPS, we can add those as file and IPS policies, and they would show up in these columns right here. So this icon represents intrusion policy. We can tack that onto one of our access control policy rules. And next to that, we have the file policy, which would be looking for malicious software, malicious files as they're being moved or attempted to be moved through the firewall. And for security intelligence, learning information from the cloud regarding IP addresses and URLs and DNS that have poor or bad reputations, we go to this tab, Security Intelligence, in the Access Control Policy to see what's currently in place regarding security intelligence. In this nugget, we've taken a look at the packet flow of traffic going through the firewall for the first time, including some of the decisions it gets to act on regarding should this traffic be allowed or not. We also identified that the overarching controlling mechanism that coordinates all those efforts is the access control policy. In the next nugget, we'll take a look at the actions that we can have in the access control policy and their intended results. So we'll take a look at that in the very next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.